So Netflix recently launched a docuseries about the blue zones. And when I first heard about it, I was really eager to watch it. And for those of you who don't know, the blue zones are basically these 5 areas in the world that a guy named Dan Buettner identified as having the largest concentrations of centenarians, which means people who live to be 100 or more. So he's got a book about it and a whole website, but this was the first time it was coming to the big laptop screen. And I was really excited to watch it, especially given the connection you always hear about blue zones and plant-based diets. And to be honest with y'all, it was a massive disappointment. I mean, I thought the first episode was decent, but it just spiraled downwards from there. I mean, there's just straight up wrong information in there that even a guy like me could pick up on. So, for example, at one point he recommends drinking wine for longevity, even though the WHO says that there is no healthy level of alcohol consumption. I'm vegan for the animals though. And what's worse is that he barely cites anything he says. So if this one is so obviously wrong, how can you trust any other claim he makes? And I'll talk more about the wine and that part later in the video. And by the way, I'm not saying that the docuseries didn't have its good parts. It did. The docuseries was at its strongest when they sat down with experts to discuss topics, which didn't happen that often. And it's also really well shot and made. I mean, for me anyways. Not that I know much about filmmaking. It was pretty, okay? It was pretty. Also, as a disclaimer, I'm basing this critique solely on the docuseries on Netflix. I haven't read the book and I haven't really looked at the website much. So if everything I'm complaining about is resolved there, well, I'm gonna look like an idiot. But you know what? I feel like the docuseries should be able to stand on its own, you know? Who's with me? All right, but anyways, going into it. So I think my first criticism of the docuseries is just how unscientific it is. Like, for the amount of claims he makes, this guy barely cites anything. I'm talking for like every 10 things he says, there's one study on screen or some vague mention of some study. And I also had an issue where he would just ask a random centenarian, oh, what's your secret to living to 100? And they would just say some random answer. And it seemed like whatever they would say, he would just go, love that. It feels like he could have asked someone who was 100 that smoked. And if they had said, yeah, it's the smoking, it's the 2 packs a day, he would have been like, that's amazing. Which, now that I think about it, is sort of what happens when he recommends the wine. But I feel like the pattern in this whole docuseries is he's going to these places and making random observations and saying, wow, that must be what makes them live so long. And I'm sure he's right sometimes too, by the way. But it just feels like there's a lack of any scientific rigor in his assumptions. Like, it feels like he's just kind of guessing, or like he's just trying to put together some story to tell. And so, like, if there had been enough people doing the worm at these Greek dance parties he was going to, I'm pretty sure he would have recommended that. Like I said, I'm sure he's right about some of the stuff he's recommending. After all, he talks about eating right and moving more. But we also have so much scientific evidence to corroborate those hypotheses of his. So for example, at one point he talks about how beans are the cornerstone of these longevity diets. And well, we do know that there are studies that link bean consumption or legume consumption to longevity. Don't worry, he doesn't cite those studies. He doesn't back up his claims or observations with existing studies basically ever. I mean, compare this to a documentary like The Game Changers, where every single claim or observation they make is backed with a study, or they sit down with an expert to talk about it. It's just a much more convincing documentary. So there's this one scene where he's in Okinawa, Japan, and he's speaking to this Okinawan lady about the medicinal properties of food. And I'm just like, who is this random lady? Like, how is she gonna know? Okay, so I just looked it up, and it says she's a traditional diet expert. What the fuck is that? Okay, she mentioned squid ink for detox. First of all, if you ever hear someone say detox, that should be an alarm bell. Like, does anybody even know what people mean when they say detox? I feel it's just like a word that people throw around, honestly. And so in the Sardinia episode, he mentions, wait, but I thought carbs were the enemy. So yeah, that triggered me a little bit. Y'all think I'm so positive, but the reality is I'm always secretly being triggered by everything. But so anyways, at this point, I think he's gonna come in with the big, well, whole unprocessed carbs are actually extremely good for you. But he just does not stick the landing. So he starts setting up how they eat some simple carbs. All right, here it comes. But the majority of the carbs they eat are complex carbs. All right, I see where he's going with this. And overall, they eat a high carb diet. All right, now hit him with it. Then he says, carbs aren't bad for you if they're prepared right. Dude, what? What a confusing message for someone who's trying to learn. So is it how they're prepared, or is it the type of carbs that they are? And as we know, what experts recommend when it comes to eating carbs is eating whole complex carbs. I've never heard anyone mention that the preparation of a carb is nearly as important as the type of carb that you're eating. And before y'all come at me, in this scene, he's in a kitchen talking about how they're actually cooking the carbs. So, and you know what, in his defense, he does put good carbs in his little circle that he builds throughout the series to show what he recommends people do. Or at least I think that's what that circle is for. I'll get more into that later. But it's just not clear messaging. Like, let's just say that if I sent an announcement that confusing back in my corporate days, my boss would be hitting me with hey, moving forward, run your emails through me before sending. Okay, so here's the part that really made me cringe. So at one point he's talking to the Seventh-day Adventists and Loma Linda, and they're promoting their religion and talking about how it gives them a sense of community. And then he goes, faith is important to longevity. He basically says, just pick a religion. Doesn't matter which one. You'll live longer. Just pick one. Like, what? And maybe your first thought is, well, being a part of a religion, maybe it helps give you that community aspect. You feel more connected. And maybe that's why you live longer. And I'm sure he's going to go into that. But nope. He just kind of mic drops and moves on. And again, to his defense, he does mention some study correlating attendance of religious services with longevity, but of course it's nowhere to be found in the show. So it just kind of leaves you lingering, wondering who's recruiting. And so coming back to the wine thing, he talks about how wine on Icaria, the Greek island, is different, it's natural, no chemicals. He says that we know when you drink Icarian wine and pair it with a Mediterranean meal, it boosts absorption of antioxidants. Okay, that's weirdly specific. And do you know that? Like, that's so specific. So it has to be those two. And then he talks to the winemakers and they're discussing the medicinal properties of the wine. And at one point, Dan Buettner straight up says, drinking the wine is like drinking a supplement. Bro, what? When you're going directly against the recommendation of the WHO, you'd think they'd come in with some kind of expert or some study. But nope, it's just them. So I guess I'll just take your word for it. And no offense to these people making the wine, I'm sure they make tasty wine, but they aren't researchers or anything. Like, how are they gonna know? Like, I'm serious, it just feels like he showed up to the place, saw the people, saw they drank wine, and said, wow, it's gotta be that. Very similar thing happens when he talks about honey. Again, same thing. They're on Icaria, the honey is different, they move the bees around, raw honey is better for you. But again, they don't cite anything, they don't have any experts speak on it. So even if it is true, without any evidence, it just feels like you're watching a high schooler on TikTok. So then there's this whole section about Nicoya, Costa Rica. And there's some actually really cool tidbits of information about Costa Rica. Apparently everybody is entitled to one doctor visit a year, which is pretty cool. Like, the doctors will go to your house apparently. Though at this point, I don't know if I can trust anything this guy says. And actually his Spanish is not bad. He mixes up tú and usted a bit, but I feel like people do that, so good on him for trying. But anyways, this part annoys me too because it contributes to the idea that you need to worry about combining plant proteins. He talks about how in Nicoya, people happen to eat a combo of 3 plant foods, beans, squash, and corn. And those combine to make a complete protein. The 3 sisters, he calls them. And the impression that he gives in this part is that people in Nicoya just happen to combine these proteins so well. And that's what contributes to their longevity. He falls short of just explaining that all plant foods have some protein. So by just eating a bunch of different plant foods, you don't have to worry about mixing and matching proteins. Again, it just feels like he's trying to tell some magical tale rather than letting people know how easy it is to get enough plant protein. There are some good parts where people are spitting though. Like in the section on Loma Linda, he sits down with this nutrition professor and he talks about, of course, the benefits of eating whole grains, legumes, fresh fruits, seeds, nuts, and veggies. And he talks about the lower rates of diseases associated with eating each of those and how it's not just how those products are healthful, but how eating meat is harmful. And it's such a pity because at the beginning of the whole show, when he's talking about the Okinawans in Japan, he specifically calls out their lower rates of diabetes and heart disease. And this is one of the few times he actually has an expert on, and that expert is able to explain how the food that people eat in the blue zones directly fight against those diseases. And I'm pretty sure it's the only time he has an expert on addressing what could be the cause of the lower rates of those different diseases in the blue zones. And it's a shame that this part feels so short. The whole plant-based section is only about 4 minutes long, especially when it's probably one of the most credible parts in the entire series. Because otherwise, when they talk about a plant-based diet or diet in general, the majority of the time it just feels like they kind of gloss over it. Another criticism I have is that the message and the takeaway is just so confusing. First of all, like I mentioned before, he's building this wheel of recommendations throughout the entire couple episodes. And it's honestly not clear if he's saying to do those individual things or if he's just looking for some kind of pattern. He never really says. But for example, in the last episode where he's summarizing everything, he sums up these 3 components on the wheel and lands on eat wisely. But like, what does he mean by that? Like, just eat wisely in general? Or do all 3 of the components? Like, what does eat wisely even mean? For example, 2 of the components, wine and moderation, I'm sure most people either are already trying to incorporate that or they do incorporate those into their lives. So wouldn't the biggest one to call out be plant-based diet? And then randomly, when he's summarizing all the suggestions, he just goes, the most important part about longevity is putting family first. That's probably 50% of the longevity formula. Dude, like, where is he getting this from? Did he just pull that out of his ass? Like, what about that guy earlier talking about beans and whole grains lowering cancer and heart disease risk? Nah, that. Don't worry about the broccoli. Just put family first. And then what's just bizarre is that after he spends basically the whole series talking about individual actions you can do to improve your life, it feels like he just switches the whole messaging and then says, actually, it's your environment that's the most important thing. So he basically spends the whole time giving you this sense of agency of the changes and decisions you can make to change your life. And then just rips the rug right from under our feet. It just seems like a really weird pivot in messaging. I mean, he could have encouraged taking individual action while encouraging people to vote for policy that promotes healthy living, Oh, and then in the last episode, he just randomly says, well, actually, there's a study out there that shows that the conversations you have with your barista are actually a better predictor of longevity than diet and exercise. Then why the am I even watching this? And like, dude, what study? Again, compare this to the Game Changers, where the strong takeaway is, hey, eat more plants, try a plant-based diet. The message here gets really lost. And then it ends with this, I find, really bizarre part where it feels like he's just trying to tie everything together and prove his point. So he goes on to attempt to apply all of these blue zone principles to a town in the US, to see if he could increase longevity there. And so immediately I'm a bit skeptical. Like, wait a second. You got all of them to eat plant-based? How the did you do that? I've been trying to get people to do that for years. Yo, we gotta get him and Ed on the phone. And so what it seems like he did was he just got them to build a bunch of bike lanes. They built like sidewalks so they could walk to the downtown. They got these people to form these community walking groups. And there was some vague mention of healthier restaurants. But that's about it. After all those changes, after 1 year, life expectancy increased. But then I was like, doesn't building bike lanes and sidewalks and doesn't that all take, more than a year? Like, how? It was just really not adding up for me. I don't know. This part just felt massively glossed over. And overall, this whole series just felt like a huge missed opportunity and a huge disappointment. I was really hoping it would be a series grounded in scientific rigor. Something that I could show to my friends so that they'd get a better and more detailed understanding of a plant-based diet. But that just does not seem to be the case here. And I don't really feel comfortable recommending this when there are so many other documentaries out there that support plant-based eating that are backed by studies and expert opinion. And like Earthling Ed pointed out in one of his most recent videos, the strength of veganism and eating a plant-based diet comes from the fact that its backbone is logic and reason and science. So the science is there for the blue zones. They really didn't bring it to the plate for the docuseries. So anyways, y'all, get your B12 supplement in. Don't forget to eat your legumes. Don't forget to like the video. And if you like this kind of content and want to see more, subscribe. I'll see y'all next time.